At 1:13 a.m., I was standing in a dark service hall behind the main tanks with my radio turned all the way down and my phone screen still lit in my hand. That was how I know the time. I checked it right before I saw the hand. It wasn't an old mark. It was fresh, wet. 5 clear fingers pressed high on the glass, then the whole thing dragged down slow enough for me to watch it happen. Water beat it under the palm and pulled into a long, shaking streak. I locked up so hard my knees felt wrong. I didn't look above it. That part I had already learned. Don't look up. Don't try to match the hand to anything. Just stand still. Breathe through it. Let it finish. To explain why I was there at 1:13 a.m., I have to go back to the start of the shift. I came into Monterey off Highway 1 just before dark, with the last of the daylight flattening out over the water and making everything look colder than it probably was. My Ford Escape had started doing that thing again, where the steering wheel gave a light shake if I stayed over 50 for too long, so I kept one hand low on it the rest of the way in and pretended I wasn't listening for every new sound the engine made. The air changed once I got closer to Cannery Row. You could smell salt first, then fryer oil from the restaurants, then that old wet wood smell that sticks around near docks even when nobody's down there. I passed souvenir shops, hotel lights, people in jackets walking the waterfront with cups in their hands, and then I pulled into the employee lot behind Tideglass Marine Center, and it all dropped off at once. The front of the place was all blue signs and clean glass and big pictures of rays and otters meant to get families through the door. The back looked like it had been built by a different company for a different reason. Concrete walls, service lights, rust stains under pipe brackets, a roll-up door with salt-dried white along the bottom seam. I killed the engine and sat there a second longer than I needed to. Rent was late. I had enough gas to get down there and get home if I didn't waste it. The passenger seat was covered in receipts, 2 empty coffee cups, and a folder with copies of a resume I was getting tired of printing. Tideglass had called me less than a day after I sent mine in. No real interview, no back and forth. Just a short call, a start time, and a reminder that the position was nights. That should have bothered me more than it did. At that point, I was way past being picky. I needed a paycheck and someplace willing to pretend my work history wasn't already bent. I got out, shut the door soft, and looked at the building again. From the lot, you could still hear the front side faintly. Kids somewhere inside. Music over lobby speakers. The kind of noise a place like that was supposed to make. Then, a steel door closed somewhere in back, and that was the sound that stayed. Not loud. Just heavy enough to remind me which side of the building I was on. Rebecca Hargrove met me in a narrow admin room off the service corridor. She wasn't old, but she had that worn-down management look where it felt like she'd stopped wasting warmth on first impressions a long time ago. She checked my name off a clipboard without offering her hand. Rebecca looked at the clipboard. Training starts in back. That was it. No welcome. No, glad to have you. Nothing that sounded like they were happy I was there. Just a body on a schedule finally showing up where they needed one. I followed her through a badge door and the place changed fast. The air got cooler. The floor went from polished lobby tile to damp concrete with a grit on it that caught under my shoes. Exposed pipes ran along the ceiling and disappeared into walls marked with stenciled numbers. Steel doors broke up the corridor every 20 feet or so. Some had laminated signs zip-tied to the handles. Some just had paint-chipped numbers and nothing else. The lights weren't bright. They were that flat industrial kind that made everything look a little tired. She walked fast, like she already knew I'd either keep up or wash out. She kept walking. If you're late on nights, don't come back. I said I understood, but only in my head. Out loud, I just kept moving. I didn't want to sound too eager. I didn't want to sound defensive either. Mostly I didn't want to sound like a guy who'd already had one good job go bad and was now taking whatever landed in his lap. We passed an intersecting corridor with a red offline placard bolted beside the door. The lights were out past the threshold. No activity, no reason to look twice. But as we went by, I heard water moving somewhere down there. Not a drip, not a leak. More like a steady, low circulation sound, like the kind you hear when a system's still pushing volume through a line. I glanced back without stopping. The corridor stayed black. Rebecca didn't look over. She either hadn't heard it or didn't care enough to explain it. At the end of the hall, a service gate buzzed and opened. A man in security black held it with one hand and looked me over like he was checking whether I'd last the week. Hector held the service gate for me. "You Brody?" I told him yeah with a nod and stepped through. The gate shut behind me with a metal snap that felt a little too final for a first night. That was the moment it really hit me that the front of Tideglass and the back of it had nothing to do with each other. Up front, families bought tickets and looked at glowing tanks. Back here, the building sweated through concrete and steel and kept its own hours. I remember thinking I just needed to keep my head down, learn the route, and make it through the night without giving anybody a reason to regret hiring me. That was still what I thought this job was going to be. Rebecca handed me off to Emily Carver like she was passing a clipboard to the next person in line. Emily looked about my age, maybe a little younger, with her hair pulled back so tight it had probably been giving her a headache since noon. There was fish water on one sleeve of her work jacket and a radio clipped high on her chest. She didn't waste time pretending nights back there were more organized than they were. She started by walking me through the route I'd be doing on my own once training was over. The path stayed mostly on the service side, which meant concrete floors, low utility lights, and long stretches where the tanks were all on the other side of thick glass and painted walls. First was the main service corridor that ran behind the public galleries. That was the spine of the whole place. Everything broke off from there. From that corridor you could cut left toward the outer wing, go farther down toward the Shark Tunnel service side, keep past that toward Quarantine, or head down the short ramp toward pump access and the log station. It was simple on paper. Check doors, check temp panels, check that certain backup light stayed green, make radio contact on schedule, sign the route sheets at the log station, call anything in that looked off. It was the kind of work I used to be good at because it was mostly attention and repetition, and I'd spent enough years around systems to know what normal sounded like when a building was full of moving water. That was part of why taking the job felt the way it did. A year earlier, I would have told myself a night position like that was temporary at best, something I'd do for 2 weeks if I got desperate. By then I was desperate enough to pull on a borrowed polo with somebody else's facility logo on it and act grateful. That part didn't need explaining. My name had already ended up on one report it shouldn't have been on. After that, references got shorter. Calls back got rarer. Places stopped asking a lot of questions because they had already decided. Tideglass had barely asked any. At the time, I told myself that was luck. Emily took me through the outer side first because feeding prep and backchecks happened earlier there. The smell hit before the room did. Fish, disinfectant, wet concrete, that faint sweet rot smell animal spaces get no matter how much bleach you use. The floor already had a damp shine to it, and there were plastic bins stacked along one wall with feed labels on blue tape. I remember that because I was reading everything. Labels, door placards, initials on clipboards, anything that made me feel more in control than I was. Emily checked a feed bin. Public side closes at 7. Back here, stuff runs all night. That pretty much set the tone. Public hours were one thing. The life support side was another. Even when the guests left, the pumps stayed on, the filters kept moving, the temperature alarm still mattered, and anything alive in the tank still needed somebody on site to notice when something slipped. From the Otter Wing, we crossed back through the service corridor and down toward the Shark Tunnel side. You couldn't see the tunnel itself from most of the employee route, just sections of the back wall, access panels, and the maintenance doors that let staff get around the curve of the exhibit without going through public space. The sound changed there. Lower. Heavier. You could hear the water mass in that part of the building more than anywhere else, not splashing exactly, more a constant pressure moving behind the walls. Emily showed me where the service window was, where to check the panel, where to call in if anything on that side looked wrong. Then, she took me past a gray steel door with a narrow viewing slit set at eye level. Quarantine 6 was stenciled on the frame. There was no extra explanation, which made me notice it more. The door had an offline placard clipped beside it, but the paint near the handle was worn in a way that said it hadn't always been left alone. I glanced at the slit and got nothing except my own shape in the glass. Emily kept moving. So did I. A little farther down was pump access. That section was louder than the rest of the route, not enough to drown anything out, just enough that you had to pay attention if your radio chirped. The floor sloped there for drainage, and the concrete under the metal grates looked darker with old moisture. Beyond that was the log station, which was really just a desk bolted to the wall beside a panel cabinet, a phone, 2 route sheets on clipboards, and a coffee maker that smelled like it had been left on since the Clinton administration. I read through the log entries while Emily checked the next board. Then I read them again. Entry times, initials, temp notes, one line about a latch sticking, one about a radio battery swapped at 6:10 p.m. Nothing dramatic. Still, I found myself checking the timestamps twice without really meaning to. That was one of the habits I'd picked up after my name landed on a report it shouldn't have. By then, Hector had made one more round through the back halls before locking down the public side for the night. He moved like he knew exactly how many miles the place added to his knees every week. No wasted motion, no fake friendliness. Hector clipped his radio back to his belt. Once I locked the front, it gets real quiet. He wasn't trying to be ominous. That was the thing. It was just true. Once the last family cleared out and the lobby music cut off, the whole building changed shape. You noticed distance more. You noticed how long some of the corridors really were. You noticed that every door on the route had its own sound, and every section of wall carried the water differently. Emily walked me back toward the main service corridor and slowed near that dark side hall I'd heard earlier. The offline placard was still there. No lights under the door. No reason for me to care about it yet. But the place had a way of making you care about the things nobody brought up. Emily looked toward the sealed corridor. If something says offline, leave it offline. She said it the same way she might have said, don't leave the freezer open or make sure the latch catches. Flat, practical, not spooky. That was probably why it stuck with me. I nodded like I understood, and I did. At least in the normal way. Systems get isolated for a reason. Bad valve, bad chemistry, quarantine, ongoing maintenance, plenty of boring explanations. Still, by the time we finished the route once and circled back to the log station, I already knew where the building felt ordinary and where it didn't. I knew which sections sounded busy and which ones swallowed sound too fast. I knew Quarantine 6 sat on the route like something people had agreed not to look at any longer than necessary. And I knew I was working too hard to seem like the kind of guy nobody had to watch, which probably meant I still looked exactly like a guy they should. The last of the public noise dropped out and the whole place felt bigger than it had an hour earlier. Not busier, just wider. The main service corridor ran both ways under those flat overhead lights, and every sound had more space around it now. A latch closing 2 halls over, water pushing through a line somewhere under the floor. My own shoes on concrete. Emily got pulled back toward feed prep, Hector went up front to finish the final lock sequence, and Rebecca disappeared the way managers always do once the building switches from people to systems. I was at the log station reading the route sheet again when Simon Creed came in and set his radio down beside the old coffee maker. He looked like a guy who'd been working nights long enough for it to settle into his face. Not wrecked, not dramatic, just worn in a specific way. His shoulders had that permanent slight drop to them, like he'd spent too many hours ducking under pipes and not enough sleeping at normal times. He wore the same navy polo I had on, but his looked older, faded almost gray at the collar. There was a damp mark across one cuff, like he'd wiped his hand there without thinking about it. He checked the wall clock, looked down the empty corridor, then reached under one of the clipboards and pulled out a folded sheet that didn't match the rest of the paperwork. The paper was soft at the creases from being folded and unfolded too many times. The edges had gone fuzzy. Half the typed lines were old root items, but there were handwritten notes squeezed in along the margins in darker ink, then newer ink over that, like different people had added to it over time and nobody had ever wanted to make it official. Simon slid the folded sheet across the desk. "Keep that on you." I looked at him. This some kind of joke? He kept his eyes on the service hall. No. That was part of why I didn't dismiss him right away. He wasn't smirking, wasn't trying to land it. If anything, he looked annoyed that he had to be the one doing it. I picked the sheet up and opened it the rest of the way. The typed part still had old root blocks on it, but somebody had crossed some of them out by hand and written 5 short lines beneath them. No title, no explanation, just 5 things written like the kind of notes people leave each other when there isn't time to argue. I read the first one once, then again, slower. It didn't make any more sense the second time. Simon tapped the first line. After 110, if you see a hand on the glass, don't look up. He tapped the next one. If the shark tunnel water moves first, turn around. I kept my eyes on the paper, mostly so I didn't have to look at him while I decided whether to be irritated or careful. It sounded like one of those weird night shift things people keep alive because the hours are too long and management isn't around to hear it. That was what I wanted it to be anyway. What got me was Simon didn't sound like he was joking, and the paper looked used in a way that bothered me. Not staged, used. There was a coffee ring in one corner, 2 old staple holes at the top, and one line had been written once, scratched out, then written again more clearly, like somebody had learned the hard way that wording mattered. I asked what the hell any of it was supposed to mean, but not out loud. Out loud, I just read the 3rd line and felt the muscles in the back of my neck tighten without a good reason for it. Quarantine 6 was the only location on the sheet that matched something I'd already seen on the route. Simon took a breath through his nose and rested one hand on the desk like he needed something steady there. He still didn't look at me. Simon took a second before answering. Quarantine 6, fogs from the inside. You leave it alone. That one hit different from the first 2. Maybe because it named a real place I'd already passed. Maybe because fogs from the inside sounded too specific to be somebody messing around. I looked back down at the paper. The line under it had a pen mark dragged through one word, then rewritten harder. Below that, another line about the otter section. I said nothing for a second. Then I read farther and felt myself getting more irritated again, which was easier than feeling unsettled. Behind us, one of the pump relays clicked on, and the vibration came up faint through the floor under the desk. He folded the sheet back once. If the floor behind Otters comes up dry, get out in under a minute. That one actually made me let out a breath through my nose, not a laugh, exactly. More like the sound you make when somebody says something so specific it circles back around to sounding stupid. I'd been in enough facilities by then to know every building had quirks. A wet spot that never dried. A panel that always ran warm. A door you had to shoulder twice when the weather changed. But once you start putting rules around that stuff, especially rules with time attached to them, it starts sounding less like procedure and more like people getting weird on overnight shifts. I flipped the sheet over like there might be something sane on the back. There wasn't. Just a faded maintenance table and one more handwritten line bleeding through from the front. The paper smelled faintly like stale coffee and damp cardboard. I asked him if Rebecca knew he was handing this to new people. That was the only part that really got under my skin. If this was some half-official thing, why wasn't it in training? Why was it tucked under old route paperwork instead of printed clean with the rest of the shift material? Simon finally looked at me then, and what bothered me wasn't fear exactly. It was the tiredness in it, the kind that comes from having the same argument too many times and losing interest in winning it. He looked at me then. And if you get wet prints with no start point, don't step in them. That was the last line. I stared at him a second longer, waiting for something else, a punchline, a shrug, some version of relax, I'm screwing with you. It didn't come. The service corridor behind him stayed empty. Somewhere farther down, a metal door opened and shut with a hollow sound that took too long to fade. He took his radio back up, clipped it on, and nudged the folded sheet closer to me with 2 fingers. Not dramatic, just final. He told me most nights passed clean. He said it like that, clean. He said the route was the route and the building would do what it always did if I did what I was supposed to do. He didn't say what happened if I didn't. He didn't have to. The paper already had that feeling built into it, not ghost story, not folklore. More like something passed from one tired person to another, because writing it down the right way would mean admitting it belonged there. The thing that stuck with me even then was that Rebecca hadn't given it to me. It wasn't in the official training packet. It wasn't laminated. It wasn't posted by any door. It lived folded into old route sheets and got handed over in low voices once the public side went dark. Whatever it was, the place had made room for it without ever saying it out loud. I folded the paper back up and put it in my pocket, because arguing any further would have made me sound greener than I already felt. I told myself it was just a night shift thing and left it at that. I didn't believe the rules. Not really. But I kept the sheet, and when Simon walked off down the corridor without looking back, I found myself checking the wall clock for no reason at all. The first stretch of the route went the way I wanted it to. I checked the main corridor doors, looked over the temp panel by the feed prep room, signed the first box on the route sheet at the log station, and made myself move at a normal pace. Not too fast, not too slow. I'd learned a while back that if you were new somewhere and trying too hard not to screw up, people could see it in how you walked. They could hear it in how often you touched things twice. I was touching things twice anyway. Every latch got a second pull. Every status light got a second look. I read the same 2 lines on the clipboard at the log station 3 times before I put the pen down. I told myself that was just me settling in. New building, new route, new habits. But that wasn't really it. The truth was, I'd gotten bad at letting a thing be checked just once. That part had been with me a while. I still had Simon's folded sheet in my pocket. I could feel it against my thigh every time I took a step. I hadn't looked at it again after he walked off. I didn't need to. The wording had stuck in my head anyway, not because I believed any of it, but because it was irritating enough to stay there. The Otter Wing was next on the route, so I headed back that way with my radio clipped high and my flashlight still off. The overhead lights were enough in that section. The smell hit me first again. Fish, damp rubber hose, bleach that never quite covered the rest of it. The room had felt wet earlier, the way it should have. Not flooded, not sloppy, just lived in. The floor back there usually held a dark shine under the lights, and the concrete closest to the holding side never really dried all the way because the air stayed cool and the work never fully stopped. I knew that because Emily had been right there an hour before, moving through feed prep like she'd walked that same path so many times her feet had memorized it. Bins, drains, hose rack, low gate. It was one of the only spots in the building that already felt familiar. That was probably why it got me. I stepped through the service door and stopped without meaning to. The floor behind the Otter side was dry. Not mostly dry, not drying, dry. Flat gray concrete with no shine on it at all. Even the stretch near the drain trench looked wrong, like somebody had laid a fresh slab in the last 20 minutes and forgotten to tell the rest of the room. I stood there staring at it longer than I should have. My first thought was airflow. Maybe a vent had kicked harder in that section. Maybe they'd changed the setting after close. Then I looked up at the vent and didn't feel anything unusual on my face. My second thought was that somebody had mopped and squeegeed it, but nobody cleaning that floor would leave the feed bins untouched and the hose still coiled the same way Emily had left it. A drain issue crossed my mind next, then HVAC again, then simple bad memory. Maybe it had never been as wet as I thought. That one lasted about 2 seconds. I knew it was supposed to stay damp back there. You work around water systems long enough, you stop noticing normal moisture until it's gone. Then it's all you can see. I keyed the radio. Otter Hall floor's dry. Emily didn't answer right away. It doesn't dry out back there. Her voice was flat, almost annoyed, which helped more than if she'd sounded rattled. It made the whole thing feel smaller. A building quirk, a maintenance issue, something I could put in a log and move past. I walked in a little farther, keeping my eyes on the floor. No fan running that shouldn't have been. No standing equipment heat, no fresh mop marks. The drain grate was clean and dark, but even the concrete around it had that dead, chalky look dry floors get when they've been dry for a while. That was the part that didn't fit. It didn't look like something that had just happened. It looked like that patch of floor had been dry longer than the rest of the room had any right to allow. I wrote it down in the margin of the route sheet anyway, because that was what made sense. Observe, note, keep moving. There was comfort in that. A lot of my job history had been built out of writing small things down before they turned into bigger things. I tried to let this be one of those. The Shark Tunnel service side was farther down and quieter than the Otter section. The sounds of the building changed as I walked. Less animal noise, more system noise. The deeper water on that side always carried differently. You could hear the weight of it without hearing any splash. Just that heavy, low movement behind walls and glass. The service access there ran along the back curve of the tunnel with panels on one side and the tank viewing glass on the other where maintenance needed it. I stopped at the service window and checked the panel first because that was what I was supposed to do. Temps looked steady. Backup light green. Nothing obvious wrong. I was already thinking about how to word the dry floor note in a way that didn't make me sound like I was overreacting on my first night when I caught movement in the tank glass. Not a body, not a shape, just the water itself. It gave one long shiver from left to right, like something big had displaced it just out of sight. My eyes went automatically to the far edge of the glass, waiting for a shark to swing through or some scheduled transfer to explain it. Nothing came. I held there another second, then 2. The water moved again first. That was the part that stayed with me later. Not that I saw something impossible. I didn't. I saw something happen in the wrong order. I looked through the tunnel glass. You got anything in pelagic moving on schedule? Static came through first, then Hector said, "Not on my board." I stayed where I was, staring through the glass like the answer might change if I gave it time. The tank looked normal again, dark blue, empty in the section I could see, a few suspended particles drifting in the light. Then another faint tremor passed through the water, not hard enough to slap the glass, just enough to wrinkle it ahead of whatever should have caused it. I didn't answer after that. My hand had gone tight around the radio without me noticing. I loosened it and took one step back from the glass, then another. I told myself it was current shift, pump pulse, some circulation pattern I hadn't learned yet, a feed response from another end of the exhibit, something ordinary that only looked wrong because Simon had put the thought in my head first. That was the explanation I gave myself anyway. The problem was I didn't fully buy it, and my body knew it before the rest of me did. My shoulders had crept up, my jaw felt locked. I kept waiting for something to swim into view and make me feel stupid. Nothing did. I moved on because standing there longer felt worse than walking, and because I still needed this job badly enough to keep calling things normal until they absolutely weren't. But the building had changed again by then, not in some huge, dramatic way. Just enough. The dry floor behind the otters, the water moving before anything showed itself. Two small things. Easy to explain if I worked at it, harder to feel okay about. And for the first time that night, I stopped thinking Simon was completely full of shit. I headed back to the log station and stood there longer than I needed to with the pen still in my hand. The place hadn't gone crazy on me. Not really. A dry floor, water moving in the wrong order, that was still a small enough pile of things to keep inside the category of building problems if I worked at it hard enough. Facilities did weird things at night. Pumps kicked strange. Air handlers shifted. Old concrete held cold in some places and let go of it in others. I knew all that. What I also knew was that I'd stopped moving like a guy on a normal first shift. I wrote the otter note down too carefully, printed cleaner than I usually did, checked the time twice before I signed my initials. Then, I turned the page back and read the last 3 entries from the earlier route again, like maybe somebody had already mentioned the floor or the tunnel and I'd missed it. Nothing. Just latch checks, feed timing, temp stable, 1 battery swap on a radio, normal notes. But when I lifted the top sheet, I noticed the lower corner of the one under it had gone damp. Not soaked, just damp enough to darken the paper along the edge. I looked down at the floor around the desk. Dry concrete, dry chair legs, dry base of the cabinet. The damp had no business being there. I touched the paper with 1 finger and pulled it back. Cool, fresh. That made me look at the rest of the stack. Most of it was current route paperwork, but there were older clipped sheets shoved under the active ones, the kind people never throw out because one day somebody might need to check a date or an initial. I started flipping through them without deciding to. The dates stepped backward week by week. Same route headings, same sections, same short notes. 1 line jumped out only because the initials at the end weren't Rebecca's or Emily's or Hector's. PH was written beside a late-night check on South Service. A few pages deeper, I found the full name in the header of an older route card. Peter Hadley. I stopped there with the paper halfway lifted and told myself it didn't matter. People quit, people transferred, old names stay in files, that was it. But the name sat wrong for some reason. Maybe because nobody had mentioned him. Maybe because the older handwriting around his roots looked tighter, more crowded, like whoever filled those sheets out had started trying too hard to fit everything in. I put the stack back exactly the way I found it and took my radio with me. I didn't like the idea of standing still much anymore. The longer I stayed in one place, the more I noticed things I didn't want to notice. The corridor out past the log station felt different now. Same lights, same doors, same painted cinder block. But the sounds had shifted a little. I could hear water where there shouldn't have been any direct line near the wall by storage, not a leak. More like movement inside the building itself, taking a turn under the concrete and carrying up through it. I stopped once and listened, then kept going because listening too hard was starting to feel like the wrong instinct. At the bend before quarantine, the air changed. Cooler. Not colder all at once. Just a narrow patch of air that felt 2 degrees lower than the rest of the hall, enough that the sweat at the back of my neck turned cool under my collar. There was a utility panel there, with a little square of safety glass over the breakers. When I passed it, I caught my reflection for half a second and thought the condensation was on the inside of the glass. I stopped and leaned back. It was on the outside of the panel, a fine misted film, not enough to drip, but enough to blur the breaker labels. The wall around it was dry. I wiped my thumb through it without thinking. The moisture came away clear. No smell. Just cold water where there shouldn't have been cold water. That was where the route stopped feeling normal and started feeling like it was leading me somewhere. Quarantine 6 sat farther down in the side corridor off the main service hall, past a stack of empty transport crates and a hose reel bolted to the wall. I told myself I wasn't heading there on purpose. That wasn't true. I was. Maybe not with both feet all the way honest about it, but enough. I wanted another look at the door. I wanted to prove to myself it was just a steel door with an offline placard clipped beside it. I wanted the building to be normal again in a way I could touch with my hand. The light above that hall was dimmer than the others, not flickering, just weaker. Quarantine 6 was at the end of it with the same narrow viewing slit set in the door. Earlier, it had shown me nothing except my own shape. This time I knew something was wrong before I got close enough to say what it was. The glass wasn't clear. It had gone milky from the inside, a white film spread across the slit, as if the tank air behind it had pressed straight up against the glass and stayed there. Not steam exactly, not the usual breath of temperature difference. This was heavier. Opaque enough that I couldn't see through it at all, but thin enough that I could tell there was movement in the whiteness if I stared long enough. I stopped a few feet back. Then I took one step closer. Everything in me wanted to wipe it clear. That was the cleanest, stupidest instinct in the world, and it hit so hard I actually flexed my right hand open before I caught myself. Wipe the glass, check the tank, confirm what's behind it. That was all. Just verify. Make the thing make sense. I pulled the radio up instead. Hector said over the radio, "Quarantine 6 is sealed. Keep moving." I kept my eyes on the fogged glass. Something's in there. The white on the slit shifted, not all at once. It changed the way heavy clouds move when you only notice after they have already crossed part of the sky. A darker patch formed somewhere behind the glass. It didn't come swimming through. It didn't rise. It was just there now where it hadn't been a second earlier, a smudge inside the blur. Emily came over the channel a second later. "Brody, leave that door alone." I stepped closer anyway, not close enough to touch it, just close enough that if I leaned in, I could have put my face right to the slit. My pulse had started beating up into my throat in that hard, embarrassing way that makes you feel less in control of your own body than you want to admit. The darker patch behind the fog sharpened by degrees. Head height, narrow through the middle, still buried in the white but arranged wrong for anything suspended in water. I didn't move. "That tank's offline." For a second I got angry, which was better than feeling afraid. Not big anger. Just that work anger that comes when something in front of you refuses to line up with the paperwork and everybody else acts like that's fine. Offline meant empty, isolated, or out of cycle. It did not mean a sealed tank with movement behind the viewing slit. She didn't look at me when she said it. "I know what the log says." That landed worse than if she'd argued with me. I could hear feed bins shifting faint in the background on her end, some metal sound set way back from her voice. She was somewhere else in the building, still doing her job, still refusing to come down there, and that told me more than anything she'd actually said. I leaned slightly to one side, trying to catch a different angle through the fogged slit. The white thinned just enough in the middle for the darker shape behind it to separate from the blur. It was upright. That was the first thing my brain gave me, and the first thing it tried to reject. Not floating, not drifting vertical because of some current. Upright. Like a person standing still in a dark room, except it was under water, or behind water, or inside something that should not have held a shape like that. The top of it sat where a head would be. The middle narrowed, one side lifted a little higher than the other, like a shoulder angled off. It didn't sway the way anything loose in a tank should have swayed. My hand came up before I noticed it, 2 fingers half extended toward the slit. Hector cut back in. "Did you touch the glass?" That snapped me just enough to stop. My finger stayed hanging in the air another second, stupid and useless, before I dropped my hand back to my side. "No," I said, and that wasn't the part that bothered me. The part that bothered me was that I had wanted to. Not because I was curious in some dumb horror movie way. because every broken piece of me that still thought doing the job right could save me had lined up behind the same impulse. Clear the view, confirm the problem, get your eyes on it. Don't be the guy who walks away from a real thing because he got spooked by bad lighting. The shape behind the glass didn't lunge. It didn't slam the door. It didn't do anything dramatic. It just stayed there inside that white blur, steady enough that the longer I looked, the worse it got. The building around me had gone very quiet without actually becoming silent. I could still hear the low system noise under the floor, a far pump relay somewhere down the hall, the faint scratch of my own breath in my nose. Then the fog on the slit thickened again. Not fast, just enough to swallow the darker shape back into the milk-white film, until all I had in front of me was my own warped reflection, pale and narrow in the little strip of glass. I backed off one step, then another. Nobody came down the hall. Nobody opened the door. Nobody fixed anything for me. Emily stayed wherever she was. Hector stayed on his end. Quarantine 6 stayed sealed. I wrote nothing down right then. I couldn't. My hands felt wrong. I stood at the mouth of the corridor for another few seconds, staring at the offline placard beside the door, like it might mean something different if I looked at it longer. It didn't. When I finally turned away, the route no longer felt like a set of checks I was completing. It felt like the building was putting things in front of me in a certain order and waiting to see what I'd do with them. And the worst part was, I couldn't tell whether that feeling came from the place itself or from me starting to come apart inside it. I got out of that side hall and moved toward the main corridor because that still felt like the safest bet. It was the spine of the building, brighter lights, more open space, the part people actually crossed through. That was what I told myself anyway. It didn't help much once I was moving. The air in the service hall felt thinner than it had earlier. Or maybe that was just me breathing wrong. I kept one hand on the radio and the other free at my side, like I was walking through a place I already expected to need both. Every door I passed looked more closed than it had an hour earlier. Every stretch of wall seemed longer. Even the hum under the floor felt different now. It had stopped blending into the rest of the building and started standing out one thread at a time. I made it to the main corridor and paused there, listening. Nothing dramatic, no alarm, no banging from Quarantine 6, just the usual noises pulled farther apart, a relay somewhere ahead, water moving under pressure behind concrete, the faint rattle of ductwork settling. On a normal night, that kind of quiet would have helped. It would have meant systems were stable and people were where they were supposed to be. I checked the route sheet again because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. My own writing from the last stop looked too neat, like somebody trying too hard to look steady. The bottom edge of the page had gone damp again. Not much, just enough to wrinkle the paper fibers near the corner. I held it up and looked at the floor beneath me. Dry. I was getting tired of seeing water where it didn't belong. I told myself I needed to loop through Service B before the next radio check. That was true. It also let me avoid standing still and thinking about Quarantine 6. Service B cut between the log station corridor and the pump access ramp, a narrower run than the main hall, with storage cages on one side and a long strip of utility wall on the other. It wasn't a place anybody spent time in unless they had a reason. That was probably why I noticed the floor the second I turned into it. There was a line of wet footprints in the middle of the corridor. Not footprints scattered around by somebody coming in off a hose job. Not random marks from boots tracking water. A line, left, right, each one clear enough to see the heel and the front edge where the sole had lifted. They started 6 or 7 feet inside the corridor, just there on the dry concrete with nothing before them. No wet threshold, no dripping door, no smears coming out of storage. Just a first print hanging in empty space where a step had somehow landed without the walk to it. I stopped so fast my heel skidded half an inch. The prints kept going toward pump access in a steady line, not close together, not wandering. Whoever made them had a normal stride. That was the part that got me first. They didn't look messy. They looked like somebody who knew where he was going and wasn't in a hurry. My radio cracked before I keyed mine. Hector's voice cracked over the radio. "I got wet prints in Service B." I stopped short. "Don't step in them." For a second, I could picture exactly where he was from the sound of his voice, not near me. Other end of the same corridor loop, maybe by the pump side intersection, seeing the same line from the other direction. The thought hit me hard enough that I took one careful step back from the first print without even feeling the floor under my shoe. He took a second before answering. "What?" "Don't step in them," I said again. There was no good way to explain that without sounding crazy, and I knew it. I could hear it in my own voice, too fast, too flat, the kind of voice people use when they're trying not to put the fear they actually feel into the words. Hector still thought in guard logic. Intruder. Wet floor. Somebody where they weren't supposed to be. He wasn't carrying the sheet Simon handed me. He didn't have the wording in his head. He just had a corridor and a problem that looked like it ought to have a person at the end of it. I moved closer without stepping into the line, following the prints with my eyes. They weren't fresh in the way splashes are fresh. They had a skin to them already, the edges settling into the porous top of the concrete. But they weren't old either. A few still held a darker shine under the overhead lights. That meant minutes at most, maybe less. The thing that chilled me next wasn't that they existed. It was that once I stopped staring at the water and looked at the spacing, I knew it. The stride was close to mine. Not exact. Not enough that I could have measured it and proved anything, but close enough that my body felt it before my head did. The length between the left heel and the next right heel. The angle of the toe out. The way one print rode slightly wider than the other. It looked like the route I took through a corridor when I was trying to move fast without calling it running. I kept my shoes planted where I was and leaned a little, checking the first visible print from different angles, as if there might suddenly be some normal explanation waiting in the texture. There wasn't. No tread pattern I recognized, no clear brand. Just the general shape of a work shoe in water dark against concrete. At the edge of the corridor, set into the utility wall, was a square maintenance window with wired glass in it. I glanced at it for half a second and saw movement behind me. I turned too fast and found nothing there. When I looked back at the glass, all I had was my own reflection stretched wrong by the wire grid, shoulders raised higher than I'd realized. I should have gone back to the main corridor right then. I know that now. But the line of prints wasn't some weird thing off to the side anymore. It had cut straight into the route, straight into the part of the building people actually used, and Hector was somewhere on the other end of it, still thinking this was his job to walk into. Static ate the next few seconds. Then Hector said, "They're headed toward pump. The rest cut out hard, not faded. Cut." 1 second his voice was there, the next second there was nothing but the dead flat hiss of an open channel. Then even that dropped. I stood there with the radio pressed too hard against my mouth and didn't say anything. Not because I had nothing to say, because anything I said would have come out wrong. I listened for him to come back, for a curse, for footsteps, for some annoyed follow-up that would make me feel stupid for how hard my pulse had just kicked. Nothing. The corridor in front of me stayed exactly the same. Wet prints leading away, dry concrete on both sides, storage cage shadows along the wall, but something had changed in the building anyway. It felt like one of the last pieces of ordinary procedure had just gone out. I moved after the prints, careful and slow, keeping to the edge of the corridor where the concrete was still clean. The line carried toward the pump ramp, then angled left in a way that made my stomach drop because it wasn't random at all. It wasn't even choosing the easiest path. It was choosing the route I'd already walked that night, the route Emily had shown me. The one from Service B toward pump access, then back up toward the main corridor bend near quarantine. The same loop. I crouched at one point without thinking, just enough to compare the distance between two prints with the span of my own stance. I stopped myself before I put my shoe anywhere near them. My balance went awkward for a second. One hand braced on my thigh, and I felt ridiculous and scared at the same time. The prints had gotten lighter ahead, then darker again, like whatever was making them didn't need to stay fully wet all the way through. That thought made no sense, but it was there before I could stop it. The pump ramp came into view. Empty. No Hector, no flashlight beam, no dropped keys, just the low mechanical noise from below and the wet line continuing down the slight slope, each mark still measured, still human in rhythm, still wrong in origin. There was a sound then, faint enough I almost told myself I'd imagined it, something hard scraping once across concrete from below, not a body drag, nothing that obvious, more like a radio getting nudged or pulled an inch and then catching. I waited for the follow-up sound. It didn't come. That was when I stopped thinking any part of the building was safe. Before that, I'd still been sorting spaces in my head. Main corridor good, log station good, feed prep occupied, service hall bad, quarantine worse. But a line of wet prints with no start point running through Service B toward pump access and ending in a missing guard stripped that down fast. It didn't matter what section label was on the wall anymore. It was in the route now, in the movement between places, in the pattern of how staff crossed from one side of the building to the other. Emily came over the channel, thin and fast. "Brody, where's Hector?" I looked down at the prints again instead of answering right away. The ramp lights reflected off the darker ones near the edge, and for 1 second, it hit me with a kind of cold, ugly certainty that I hadn't felt before. This thing wasn't just showing up where there was water. It was learning where we went, learning how we moved through the building when we were alone. That was why the stride looked familiar. That was why the line didn't wander. It was following a path already laid down by staff feet in late-night habit. My route, or close enough to it that I couldn't tell the difference anymore. I should have stayed where I was and waited for Emily to come around from her side of the building. That would have been the smart move. But smart gets slippery once you start thinking somebody else is paying for your hesitation. Hector had gone off the board near pump access. The wet prints had led that way. Then the radio cut. That was enough on its own to get me moving, but it wasn't what finished the job. What finished it was the sound that came after. It came low through the corridor wall at first, so faint I thought it was one more piece of mechanical noise getting into my head. Then it came again. A short scrape. A metal knock. Not loud, but close enough to shape itself into something human once my mind got hold of it. I moved down the ramp toward Pump Annex before I'd fully decided to. The annex sat off the lower utility run, one steel door, one small wired glass panel, one pull station beside it, all built to look less important than it really was. Earlier in the night it had just been another spot on the route. Now it looked like the kind of place somebody could get trapped in without anyone noticing until morning. The lower I got, the more the building sounds thinned out. The hum of the pumps dropped behind thicker concrete. The air felt colder down there, not in a dramatic way, just enough that the sweat on my back went cool under the polo. The floor near the annex door was dry, cleaner than the rest of the ramp. That bothered me immediately because it meant I couldn't use the wet prints anymore. Whatever line had led Hector down there didn't continue where it should have. Then I heard it again from the other side of the door. One hard little hit. Then nothing. I stepped up to the wired glass panel and tried to see through it. Most of what I got was my own face broken up by the safety mesh. Dark room beyond. No alarm light. No movement I could swear to. I keyed the radio with my thumb and didn't get Hector. I tried again. Nothing. Then the channel clicked live without me pressing it, and I heard my own name in a voice that was almost normal. Not perfect. Just close enough. The problem with voices like that is your brain fills in the missing parts for them. I couldn't have told you later whether it sounded more like Hector or Rebecca, or just a male voice flattened by the radio speaker. All I knew in the moment was that it carried urgency and location, and that was enough to make my hand go straight for the annex handle. It was the same reflex that had wrecked me before. Not panic, not laziness, the need to fix the uncertainty by putting my own eyes on it. I'd done it on a different night in a different building with a warning I should have checked in person. We had a pressure drop on a side loop, and I told myself it was transient, sensor drift, something that would settle out before I got there. I signed off on it anyway. By the time somebody actually checked the line, the small problem had already spread into 3 others. We lost stock. A guy from the next section took a bad fall in the scramble to shut part of the loop down. Nobody died, but that didn't matter once my name was sitting under a line saying I'd verified something I hadn't actually put eyes on. That sticks to you, not just on paper, in your hands. So when I stood in front of that annex door, with a maybe voice on the radio and a sound from the other side that might have been a body hitting metal, every rotten piece of that old mistake lined up behind the same thought. "Don't miss it again," Emily said over the radio. "Where are you?" "Pump Annex," I said. She answered too fast. "No, I'm looking at Pump Annex right now." Everything in me went bad at once, not just fear, confusion first, then anger at the confusion. Then that awful thin feeling when you know the ground under your thinking just gave a little and you still haven't found out how far. I looked at the door in front of me, looked at the wired glass, looked down the ramp behind me, like I'd somehow missed another annex, another door, another version of the same hallway. There wasn't one. I heard how unsteady I sounded. "Then who the hell just called me down here?" Emily didn't answer right away. "Brody, don't verify it for him." That line went through me harder than if she'd yelled, because she was right. My hand was already on the handle, not all the way closed around it, but there, resting on cold metal like the next second belonged to the door and not to me. If she'd been 2 beats later, I would have opened it. I know I would have. I pulled my hand back so fast I scraped my knuckles on the latch plate. The sting helped. So did the shame. I stood there breathing too hard in a half-lit pump corridor with my hand throbbing and my radio hot against my palm, and all I could think was how easy it still was. How little it took. One sound in the right place, one pressure point, one situation that looked enough like a real emergency, and I was right back at the worst part of myself. I pressed my forehead once against the cool cinder block beside the door and shut my eyes. Just once. Not because that solved anything. Because I needed 1 second where I wasn't looking at the handle. Emily kept talking after that, but not in full sentences I really heard, just enough to keep my channel anchored somewhere outside my own head. I told her I was stepping back. I think I told her twice. The words came out flat and stupid. My mouth felt dry, even though the air down there was cold enough to raise gooseflesh on my forearms. When I finally looked at the wired glass panel again, I didn't try to see into the annex. I looked at the reflection instead. Mine was there. Sort of. The mesh in the glass warped it, so for a second I told myself that was all I was seeing. But the shape in the reflection wasn't holding itself the way I was. My shoulders were high and tight. The one in the glass looked looser, straighter, like it had learned the outline but not the tension under it. When I shifted back a step, it followed a fraction too smooth, too clean, like somebody copying your walk after watching it enough times. That was when it finally clicked for me. The prints weren't just leading staff around. The fake call wasn't just trying to get me near a door. The voice on the channel hadn't picked a random emergency. It had picked the exact kind that would work on me. The exact kind that would put my hand on a handle, because I couldn't stand the thought of failing a check again. It wasn't just luring me deeper into the building. It was learning how Brody Sinclair moved when he thought somebody needed him to look. I backed away from Pump Annex like the door might take it personally if I moved too fast. My hands still hurt where I'd clipped the latch plate, and the sting helped keep me in one piece. Emily stayed on the channel, not saying much now, just enough to remind me there was still another living person in the building who wasn't part of whatever this had turned into. I told her I was heading back up. She told me to keep talking if I passed out of the main light. I don't remember what I said after that. Probably nothing useful. What I did remember once I got back to the log station was Peter Hadley's name. The desk was exactly where I'd left it. Clipboards, old coffee smell, route sheets stacked under the active log. Same dead little workspace it had been all night, except it didn't feel harmless anymore. It felt like the place where people had been trying to leave each other just enough to survive without making any of it official. My hands were shaking a little, which made flipping paper more annoying than dramatic. I kept losing the corners, kept taking 2 sheets at once. The damp edge on the older stack had spread farther now, a little curl starting in the bottom corner. I worked backward through the route cards until I hit the older handwriting again. Tighter print, more margin notes, more things crossed out and rewritten, same initials in some places, PH in others, then the full name on an older route header. I found Peter Hadley's name on the old route sheet. He worked nights? Emily let that sit there. Until he didn't. That was all she gave me, and somehow it told me more than a long explanation would have. Not because it answered anything cleanly, because it told me Peter was one of those names a building keeps after a person stops being part of it, a gap with paperwork around it. I kept digging. The older route sheets weren't some hidden file. That was the worst part. They were just there, mixed in with the rest. You only had to care enough to keep looking. A few of Peter's notes were ordinary. Temp stable, latch checked, south return normal. But then the handwriting changed shape over a couple weeks. Same route, same sections, but more small notes shoved into margins like he'd started trying to pin down things the printed form didn't have room for. Check slid only from back angle. Don't clear glass. If south service is dry, reroute. One page had a coffee stain over half the lower notes, but I could still make out part of one line written heavier than the rest. Don't follow? The rest was gone under the ring. Another sheet had the typed route for the south wing crossed out by hand and replaced with a shortened loop that cut around Quarantine 6. A different pen had added one word beside the change later on. Better. That hit me harder than I expected. It explained anything supernatural, because it told me Simon's folded list hadn't come from nowhere. It had been boiled down from trial and error. Bad trial and error. Somebody seeing one thing, then another thing, then writing down only the part that seemed to keep people alive. Over time, the building had scraped the reasons away and left the behavior. The rules sounded like that for a reason. They weren't superstitions. They were what got left after people stopped writing the reasons down. I looked up from the desk and finally noticed the laminated utility map pinned beside the panel cabinet. I'd seen it before, never really looked at it. Lines, loop labels, shut-off points, colored arrows for circulation. The south wing and Quarantine 6 shared a return branch before the line fed back toward the lower filtration side. Pump Annex sat just off that section, tied into the same service access. Not one tank, not one room, a loop. That made the rest of the night rearrange itself in my head all at once. The dry floor behind Otter's hadn't just been random wrongness. Something had pulled moisture out of the wrong place. The tunnel water had moved ahead of whatever shape was using it. Quarantine 6 had fogged from the inside because something behind that glass was pressing toward definition, not just floating in a tank. The wet footprints had appeared in Service B because by then it wasn't staying in the waterside logic of the building. It was crossing into ours through the paths we used to move through it. Emily started talking again, quieter now, like she was working something out at the same time I was. Not lore. Just the little things she'd noticed on her end and never liked enough to say out loud. Otters bunching away from one service wall before late-night checks. Pelagic fish clearing one section of the tunnel right before the water rolled weird. Condensation showing up on the wrong side of a viewing panel and being gone by morning. She kept it practical, which helped. Animal behavior, recurring sections, timing. The kind of stuff people notice when they spend enough nights in one place. Rebecca came over the emergency line. Stay out of quarantine and wait for maintenance. I actually laughed once under my breath when I heard that, not because it was funny, because that was the first time all night she had sounded like somebody trying to control the story instead of the shift. You knew about this, I told her. There was a pause long enough to say more than a fast answer would have. In the background on her end, I could hear another phone ringing somewhere and getting ignored. She wasn't in the dark about any of it. Maybe not the shape of it, not the full thing, but enough. She took her time answering. I knew enough to keep that wing closed. That made me angrier than I wanted to be. Not clean anger, tired anger. The kind that comes when you realize a place has decided there's an amount of wrong it can live with as long as the door's still open in the morning. Rebecca wasn't a villain. I could hear that much. She sounded scared and managerial in exactly the wrong ratio. She knew where the problem lived, roughly. She knew the workarounds. She knew what not to write down. What she had not done was shut the system behind it off for good. Probably because shutting a whole wing down costs money. Costs exhibits, costs explanation, costs jobs. I looked down while she was still on the line and saw a set of wet marks fading near the leg of the desk. Not full prints, just partial dark patches where something damp had stood long enough to start drying. They weren't there 10 minutes earlier. I was sure of that. One had the faint curve of a heel. Another looked like the front half of a sole that never finished touching down. I looked at the wet marks drying on the concrete. It's not trying to get out. Everything got quieter after I said it, not the building. Me. Because once that thought landed, the rest of it fell into place fast. If it had just wanted out, it had chances. Quarantine 6, Pump Annex, Service B, the main corridor. Plenty of bad opportunities. But that wasn't the pattern. The pattern was always one step short of completion until somebody helped. Look longer, wipe the glass, open the door, step into the tracks, follow the route, confirm it with your own eyes. It didn't force the last part. It set the table and waited for a person to finish the shape. Emily said quietly, "Then what's it doing?" I looked at Peter Hadley's name again, at the older notes, at the shortened route around South Wing, at the shutoff diagram on the laminated map. Peter wasn't important because he was a ghost or some neat answer. He was important because the old paperwork bent around him the same way the newer paperwork had started bending around me. Same wing, same late shift, same bad little cluster of workarounds. Somewhere around Peter, the system had learned enough of a person to keep trying. Now it had a new set of habits to copy. Mine, the way I doubled back, the way I checked, the way I moved faster when I thought somebody might be in trouble. It was sinking to me because I kept feeding it the one thing it needed most: completion. I pulled the utility map off the wall hard enough to pop one thumbtack loose. The isolation points were marked in red grease pencil from some old maintenance update: south return, auxiliary intake, quarantine branch. It wouldn't kill the whole building, but it would gut that side of it. Dark tanks, circulation loss, emergency response, questions from management. I would never answer cleanly enough to keep my job. I knew that right then, before I even touched a panel. Didn't matter anymore. I folded Peter's old route sheet once and shoved it into my pocket with Simon's list. Then I took the map and headed for the south side isolation panel. From that point on, the only move left was to cut the loop before it finished learning how to walk through it as me. The south side isolation panel sat past the lower pump access, behind a waist-high rail and a gray metal cabinet with chipped paint around the hinges. I'd walked past it earlier without giving it more than a glance. At that point, it had just been one more piece of infrastructure in a building full of moving water. Now it looked like the only thing in the place that still made sense. Steel box, labeled levers, old warning stickers, no mystery to it, just consequence. Getting there was the hard part. I took the lower service run because it was the shortest way in, map folded in one hand, radio in the other. The building felt tighter than it had an hour earlier, like the walls had come in half an inch without bothering to make a sound about it. Every section of glass I passed reflected me back in pieces. Not wrong enough to stop me at first, just off by the kind of detail you don't want to stare at. My shoulder angle a little too level, my head not turning at exactly the same time as my body. The kind of thing you can blame on bad lighting if you keep moving. Then I hit the first handprint. It was on the glass beside the south service turn, right at my height, fresh, full palm, long fingers. The water was still running down in a narrow thread from the heel of it. I stopped so hard my shoes barked once on the concrete. The print was placed exactly where a person would have braced a hand to lean in and look through. Exactly where I would have. I kept my eyes below it and moved past. The next section of glass was worse because it gave me more than a print. It gave me a reflection. Mine, mostly. Same work shirt, same narrow shoulders, same radio clipped high. But the rhythm of it was wrong. It moved with me, but too smoothly, like it had studied the route enough to know what I would do before I did it. I didn't look twice. I knew by then that the second look was where it got traction. The second look was the part where my brain would start trying to fix details for it. Height, posture, face, all the little missing pieces. One more second of that and I had a bad feeling I'd finish the job for it. I kept going. The closer I got to the panel, the more the signs piled up in front of me. Condensation on the wrong side of a wired glass door. A smear of water dragged along a painted cinder block at shoulder level. One dark patch on the floor that wasn't a full footprint yet, just the front half of one, like a step trying to decide whether it had fully landed. None of it blocked the way. That was the worst part. It didn't have to. It just had to make me slow down and look. The radio clicked live in my hand before I said anything. Rebecca said over the line, "If you shut that loop down, you lose the whole south wing." She sounded closer now, probably patched into the emergency channel from somewhere up front, maybe with a maintenance binder open in front of her, maybe finally looking at the same system map I'd yanked off the wall. I could hear strain in her voice now, and money and paperwork, and the very real understanding that if I dropped that loop, the damage wouldn't stay neat. Quarantine, south service, tunnel support, everything tied to that branch would go dark or unstable fast. "I know," I said. I was already at the rail by then. The gray cabinet was unlocked. Of course it was. In a real emergency, somebody had to be able to get to it quickly. I pulled the door open and the metal creaked once, loud enough to make me flinch. Inside were the lever labels, faded but readable. South return. Auxiliary intake, quarantine branch. The red emergency isolation lever sat off to the side under a plastic guard with a cracked corner. I lifted the guard. Something moved in the cabinet door reflection. Not a clean face, not even a face, really. More the arrangement of one. The suggestion of a head over shoulders, dark shirt, my outline. It was standing where I should have been if I were half a step farther back. Waiting in exactly the place I would have occupied if I had hesitated longer. When I shifted my weight, it matched me a fraction too late, like it had to borrow the motion and then settle into it. Emily's voice came in under hers. "Brody, if you're doing it, do it now." That helped more than I can explain, not because it made me brave, because it cut through the part of me that still wanted another second to be sure. That was always the weakness. Another second, another look, another check, enough time to make the thing in front of me line up into something I could sign my name under. Rebecca raised her voice for the first time. "Do not touch that panel." I put my hand on the emergency lever. "Then fire me." I pulled it hard. The first thing I felt was the resistance in the mechanism. Real, mechanical resistance. Springs, linkage, age in the hardware. Then the lever gave and the whole system answered at once. Somewhere deep under the floor, heavy valves started to move. A low metallic thud rolled through the concrete, followed by a deeper shudder that came up through my legs and into my ribs. The overhead lights in the south, Run flickered once, held, then dropped half their strength before the backup circuit caught. Farther down the corridor, the viewing panels went dark one section at a time, not all at once, in steps. Blue gone, then black. The reflection in the cabinet door broke apart when the light died. Not vanished. Broke. Like it had been held together by too many weak surfaces at once, and the shutoff had taken half of them away. Then the sound hit. Not a scream. Nothing that easy. Just a hard, ugly rush through the pipes, like water being forced to change its mind under pressure. It ran through the south side line and cut out in stages, relay, valve, deep pump drop. Then a silence that didn't belong in that part of the building. I stumbled back from the cabinet and hit the rail with the backs of my knees. The air felt wrong without the constant system movement, empty, flat. My radio was full of clipped voices and dead static after that, but nobody said Hector's name again for a while. That told me enough. They found me still sitting on the floor by the isolation panel some time later, not long before dawn. Emily got there first, Rebecca after that, maintenance after that. Nobody asked me for a full explanation right then, which was good, because I didn't have one that would survive daylight. I gave them the only version that fit on paper. System instability, visual anomalies, possible unauthorized movement in the south service route, emergency isolation to contain a branch failure. It sounded bad enough to end my job and not strange enough to make them call somebody with questions they didn't want asked. Hector never got a clean ending, at least not one anybody gave me. His radio was found, one glove too. The report treated the gap around him like a scheduling problem that turned into a search problem and then into an internal matter. Tideglass was good at that, making blank spaces sound administrative. Rebecca called me 2 days later and fired me without dragging it out. Her voice was back to flat by then. Facility damage, unauthorized emergency action, pending internal review, no further shifts. She didn't call me a liar. She didn't call me unstable. She didn't have to. The outcome covered both. A month later, if you check the Tideglass site, the south wing was listed as temporarily closed for infrastructure work. That wording stayed up longer than temporary should have meant. I told myself that was the end of it. That this time, I hadn't looked away from something real just to keep the shift clean. Some nights I can almost believe that. Then 1:10 a.m. comes around, and if I'm near glass, I still check it without meaning to. Every time. And once in a while, I see a wet handprint form at my height from the wrong side and start to drag slowly down.